just blew the lid off everything you think you know about Bitcoin. From the death of the US dollar, to Bitcoin saving the middle class, to Wall Street's desperate pivot, this isn't just another crypto pump story. This is the final battle for financial freedom, and it starts right now. Let's break it down fast. It just convinces me even more that the actual path towards financial freedom, sovereignty, and wealth preservation and even capital growth into the long term, it really convinces me that I've done the right thing, the right investment decision to hold on to Bitcoin into the long term, not to be seen as that day trade speculative asset. For that we have the rest of the dinky old equity stocks out there, and God knows how many thousands upon thousands of those crypto tokens that really don't add value, it only adds confusion. The journey on the actual El Salvador Bitcoin route to freedom. This is very interesting because El Salvador is one of those Central American nations that have actually started with a sense of urgency as a nation. It had many problems, many issues that are particularly akin to El Salvador. Things like excessive rates of crime, lack of opportunities, lack of capital growth into the country so it can actually establish companies in order to innovate and bring prosperity to the country and indeed to the public coffers, to the government in the region. Now, these are just a handful of the rather unique set of issues that El Salvador had to actually turn around quite quickly, which is what President Bukele have actually done ever since he's taken up office in the country. So part of the success of that turnaround for El Salvador was with Bitcoin, in that it is unique but historically symbolic. And why is that? It's because El Salvador, as most of the small nations, there isn't much of a propensity to have or resort to their own local currency, which is quite irrelevant or negligible if you put it within the grand scheme of the fiat world, right? It's nowhere near to those larger fiat currencies, whether it's the US dollar, the euro, the sterling pound, the yen. So in that case, it had an even extra urgency to achieve a more of a neutral type reserve asset, which can be the US dollar. But what they've done is they've actually legislated Bitcoin as that legal tender in order to become that sovereign lifeline for the ordinary man and woman in the street in El Salvador, and why Bitcoin has actually helped them achieve that neutral reserve asset rather than resorting to their own local currency. And that's what they've done, and that actually has contributed a greater degrees of success, as I said before, not only in terms of legitimizing Bitcoin as that legal tender, as that legal media exchange currency, to satisfy the day-to-day commerce in the region, but also use it as a store of value, which is how the rest of us Bitcoin holders are treating the asset, as that preservation of wealth and capital growth into the long term. So it's actually perfectly in line with the local government ambitions around aligning Bitcoin with freedom, energy, and growth. So this is the precursor that the US may be indeed the next nation to legitimize Bitcoin, which, following the announcement, the executive order announcement from President Trump to adopt Bitcoin as a strategic reserve asset holding at a federal level, we're in roads to achieving that. If El Salvador could do it without a central bank, i.e. without adopting their local currency, what excuse do powerful nations have? I think that's the bottom line. Now, if we move on to the next point, very interesting point around the US accumulating Bitcoin. So the dollar's status as the world reserve currency, if you look at it at its trajectory, it's unsustainable. What do I mean by sustainable? It's because, as with most fiat currencies, the tendency is actually debase in value. So the currency is losing value over time. All of the fiat currencies are suffering a huge currency devaluation. Why we are beginning to witness that rotation back to a neutral asset, which is predominantly led by Bitcoin because of its attributes, right? It has a finite supply of 21 million Bitcoins. The network is the most decentralized network on earth, which makes it highly secure and highly resistant to tampering, fraud, as well as many other attributes that it has. It also acknowledges that Bitcoin's role in that shift could be indeed one of America's most strategic moves in modern history. The next point is, which I think it really brings it back down to earth as to the bottom-up Bitcoin by the people for the people type asset. In that, how can Bitcoin solve the pain of the average citizen out there as that equalizer? Let's be honest. Let's move away from this government manipulated figures like the CPI and the inflation rate. It's not the 2 to 3%. It's actually much higher than that. It's into the double digit teens, 20% plus. Because if you want real assets like acquiring homes, real estate, such as in Miami or in Manhattan or in London or in Paris or in Tokyo, it doesn't matter. The point is, the inflation rate is nowhere near to 2 to 3% that the governments are trying to sell at, because it costs that much more in order to acquire these lucrative assets. You either own your assets or you don't. It's just as simple as that. There is no middle ground. The wealth gap is widening every year, and we can see disparity of the wealth between individuals, between the different classes in every nation state. So unless you actually own something that resists debasement, you're not going to be able to equalize this wealth gap. I think that's the point. So indeed, Bitcoin is that great equalizer asset that people should start to invest in, because it's egalitarian. What do I mean by egalitarian? That is open to everyone in all walks of life. Everyone can access it, anyone can invest in it, and also for individuals that are unbanked or debanked, depending on the parts of the world that they reside in. Again, that's another attribute in terms of widening the net of accessibility into Bitcoin to absolutely everyone, which is truly unlike any other legacy asset that we've seen before. The only way that you can front run a rich person out there is just simply buying into Bitcoin, holding it to the long term, and forget about it. That's the bottom line. So this is indeed the greatest wealth divide that we've seen in modern history, and you can simply choose your side with a single application. This leads to my next point around Wall Street and Bitcoin. Now, it's fair to say that most of the hardcore Bitcoin maximalists, they are very anti-TradeFi, anti-traditional finance and anti-capital markets. So Wall Street, has actually finally admitted it, that Bitcoin works as that store of value. I don't need Larry Fink to hold my Bitcoin, which is true, because we all know that there are approved Bitcoin spot ETFs as an entry point for institutional investors to buy in to the Bitcoin underlying through these ETF shares. It's true, you don't need to actually own that in order to get exposed to Bitcoin. You can just simply allocate a small proportion of Bitcoin in your portfolios directly under a self-custody arrangement. But of course, for that you need to be prepared. You need to be able to train yourself to manage those private keys, those seed phrases, and your hardware wallets or cold storage like your Trezor device or your Ledger Nano X. There are tons of videos out there at your disposal where you can just simply follow the instructions, and the only thing that you need to worry about is how to safeguard these seed phrases themselves. So rather than keeping paper copies floating around your house, my advice is to look for more confidential means of storage, whether it's in a will and testament document, depending on how robust the notary services are there out in the country that you reside in, or equally make virtual copies and hold it into a password vault. So there are several leading software password vault apps, and also sharing that information between one or two family members, so you have kind of a multiple virtual copies of those keys to those that you fully trust. So there's multiple ways that you can actually protect in a secure fashion those seed phrases in order to gain access to your Bitcoin holdings or digital tokens that you may have. So basically, we ought to embrace TradeFi, because for the reason I just mentioned, Bitcoin is truly decentralized. It doesn't matter how much Wall Street gets in, you can't actually move the needle that much. And that's going to become even more pronounced as there is more capital inflows brought into the Bitcoin network, because you're going to be creating a more solidified capital base. You remember, it's almost $2 trillion today, but there are predictions that it's going to be 10x, even 20x of that in the next 10 to 20 years. So the widening of the capital base in the network will mean in essence, that the volatility will decline because no matter how much more you invest or you sell under that humongous base underneath, it's going to be rather difficult to move the needle in terms of price. So that is the extra comfort and an extra reason why you should actually look into investing part of your wealth into Bitcoin as that long-term wealth capital preservation. So that is my advice. And this leads to my last point. Given that there is $900 trillion wealth out there in the world, Bitcoin is chasing half that amount, between $400 to $500 trillion market, as that global store of value. So things like real estate, collectibles, cash, gold, it's all on the table for Bitcoin to demonetize and take over, which is all the more reason why once you buy into the Bitcoin, hold it for the long term under self-custody arrangement and just forget about it. Everyone's trying to preserve value. Bitcoin is, in fact, the purest form of that. Bitcoin isn't going to 100K. It's indeed chasing that $500 quadrillion prize. That is the message I'd like to leave you today. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to hit the like button, to share the video to friends and colleagues at work, and if you haven't done so already, to please subscribe to my channel, as I regularly publish some interesting videos such as these. Anything to do with Bitcoin, blockchain technology, and the future of finance. So till next time.